The fluorescent lights hummed above polished linoleum, a sound like electricity trapped in glass tubes, as Laura Bennett moved through Mercy General's orthopedic wing with the quiet efficiency of someone used to working in silence. Her navy blue scrubs were faded from 1,000 washes, the fabric soft as skin in places, thin enough to show the outline of the bandage she wore on her left shoulder, a scar shaped like a question mark that she never discussed. Her badge clipped to her pocket read simply, Del Bennett, RN. Nothing else. No credentials listed. No years of service noted. Just initials and a last name, the way hospitals did when someone arrived with a federal directive and a sealed file marked Do Not Open. She checked vitals on 3 patients before 0700 hours. Mechanical precision. Temperature. Blood pressure. Oxygen saturation. Her hands moved through the motions with a kind of steadiness that came from repetition, thousands of repetitions, enough to bury muscle memory so deep that her fingers knew what to do before her mind caught up. But when she held the charts, when she stood still long enough for anyone to really look at her, a tremor appeared in her left hand. Small. Barely visible. The kind of thing a careful observer might mistake for fatigue or age. It had started 5 years ago, the same day her entire history was sealed behind federal paperwork and classified stamps, the same day Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett of SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, stopped being anyone at all. The nurses' station occupied the center of the wing, a semicircular desk surrounded by computer terminals and rolling charts. Dr. Malcolm Hargrove stood there at 0715, reviewing surgical schedules with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for men counting money. His tailored white coat fit him like armor. His tie was silk, actually silk, not the polyester blend the other physicians wore. His cologne cut through the antiseptic smell of the hospital like a knife, expensive and aggressive, the kind of scent that announced his presence before his voice did. When he glanced up and saw Laura approaching with the vital sign reports, his eyes moved across her name badge and then looked away just as quickly, a dismissal so complete it was almost surgical. Dr. Hargrove, she said quietly. Vitals for 412. He didn't look up from his screen. Just leave them. She placed the chart on the desk. His hand came down on it without reading a single line, already turning back to whatever calculations held his attention. His fingers were manicured. His nails looked like they'd never worked a full shift. Laura had seen his personnel file once, accidentally left open on a break room computer. University of Southern California Medical School. Stanford for residency. Chief of surgery at 39 years old, which meant he had connections that had nothing to do with competence. Those were the men most dangerous in hospitals. They had nowhere to fall. The intake coordinator's voice came over the intercom at 0742, not loud, but urgent in the way hospital announcements always were. New patient transfer, incoming. ETA 8 minutes. Orthopedic wing, bed 6. Laura didn't look up from the medication cart she was organizing. Saline. Antibiotics. Pain management in graduated doses. Standard admission prep. The coordinator's voice came again. Marcus Reeves, 47 years old, retired Navy SEAL, complex spinal injury. Multiple surgical consultations already requested. That word, SEAL, landed like a stone in still water. Laura's hand stopped moving. Her tremor vanished. For exactly 3 seconds, her breathing held at a depth that nobody would notice unless they were trained to notice. Her eyes flickered to the clock. 0742, 8 minutes. Marcus Reeves was wheeled into bed 6 at 0750 by transport staff who moved like they were carrying something breakable. The wheelchair was hospital issue, chrome and vinyl, the kind that looked designed to humiliate. His body was positioned at a 45-degree angle, his spine clearly unable to maintain anything closer to vertical. He was a large man, probably 220 pounds, 6 feet tall, the kind of frame that still showed military conditioning underneath the weight of immobility. His skin was pale from weeks of indoor confinement. His dark hair was cut short, military short, the kind of haircut a man keeps because it's what he knows. His hands rested on the wheelchair's arms with the kind of stillness that came from acceptance or resignation or some combination of both. But it was his eyes that Laura felt before she saw them. When she rolled the blood pressure cuff toward him, his gaze moved to her face with the intensity of a weapon locking onto a target. Not hostile. Not threatening. Just present. Completely, utterly present, the way most people never learn to be. She had seen eyes like that before, eyes that had survived things that would break standard human architecture. She knew those eyes the way bodies know their own language. "Good morning," she said, keeping her voice level. "I'm going to check your vitals." He nodded once. A gesture so minimal that it was almost a twitch. His hand signed something in ASL. Laura caught only the broad shape of it, not the meaning. She made a mental note to find the hospital's ASL interpreter. There should have been one waiting at bedside. An elderly woman sat beside him, her spine curved like a question mark, her hands twisted with what looked like advanced rheumatoid arthritis. His mother. She had to be. She wore a cardigan in July, the kind of defensive clothing people wore when they'd been cold for too long from worry. His father stood by the window, tall, military-bearing, the way men who'd served still carried themselves even decades out. Both of them watched Laura's hands move with the intensity of people whose son couldn't hear her voice and might depend on her anyway. "Has he seen a surgeon yet?" his mother asked. Her voice was thin, worn down by repetition of this question. "We're getting consultations," Laura said, and it was true, but it was also the kind of truth that meant nothing. Getting consultations from doctors who were already planning to say no. She'd seen the pattern before in this hospital. Difficult patients. Expensive cases. Liability concerns. The language was always clinical, always reasonable, always protected by the architecture of American medicine, which was really just capitalism wearing a stethoscope. At 0847, the first refusal came through. Dr. Hargrove presented it himself, standing in the doorway of bed 6 with a surgical resident 2 steps behind him like a shadow. He didn't come all the way into the room. "The communication barriers make this case impossible," he said, not to Marcus, not even really to his parents. Just announcing it, the way you might announce a restaurant was closed. Deaf patients in acute surgical situations create liability we simply cannot manage. Post-operative compliance is critical, and without auditory communication. "He can read," Laura said quietly. Dr. Hargrove's eyes landed on her for exactly 1 second, the way a predator might glance at something too small to hunt. "Notes, please, Ms. Bennett." She was already writing. There was a particular way to document refusals. You had to be precise. You had to list the physician's exact words, the timestamp, the clinical reasoning provided. This was Laura's gift, actually, the ability to write down what happened in language that was impossible to argue with later. She'd been doing it for years. For 5 years in this hospital. For much longer before that, in places that didn't appear in any official record. The second refusal came at 10:30. Third at 11:45. The chart was starting to look like a medical death certificate, each refusal a signature on a document that said nobody here wanted him. By 15:30 there were 8 refusals. By 1900, 15. 15 separate physicians, each with their own reasoning. Communication barriers. Liability concerns. Lack of specialized equipment. Complexity beyond current resources. The language was consistent. The message was identical. And nobody had looked Marcus Reeves in the eyes when they said it. Laura sat at the nurse's station at 20:15, after her shift ended, and read through every single refusal. Her hands were steady now. She'd already completed her documentation. She'd already spoken to his parents in the quiet voice they'd come to recognize as the only voice in the hospital that didn't sound rehearsed. She'd told them what she was required to tell them, that other consultations could be arranged, that specialists could be brought in from outside the system. She'd told them what she wasn't required to tell them, but what they needed to hear, that this wasn't about Marcus's condition. This was about something else entirely. The rain started at 20:45, drumming against the windows with the sound of applause for something nobody was celebrating. Laura stood in the parking lot with her jacket half-zipped, rain soaking through her hair, and looked back at the building. 15 doctors. 15 refusals. One patient who'd survived 7 combat deployments, survived IEDs and small arms fire and the grinding horror of urban warfare, only to be abandoned in a hospital bed by physicians who were afraid of liability. She didn't know why she knew that Marcus Reeves was important yet. She didn't know why his eyes had landed on her face and something in her body had recognized him, the way animals recognize members of their own pack even when they've been separated for years. But what she did know was this: Mercy General was about to meet someone who didn't say no. And that wasn't going to end well for anyone. Dr. Hargrove arrived in Marcus Reeves's room at 2:44 p.m. on a Wednesday, his white coat pressed sharp enough to cut glass, his stethoscope draped like a weapon across his shoulders. Laura was mid-sentence with Marcus, her hands moving through the fluid geometry of ASL she'd been teaching herself from a library book, the sign for surgery repeated 3 times, slow enough for him to read her palms. Marcus's elderly parents sat by the window, his mother's fingers twisted in her purse. Hargrove's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Nurse Bennett. Perhaps you could explain to Mr. and Mrs. Reeves why their son's case requires actual medical expertise, not nursemaid enthusiasm." He didn't look at her. He looked at the parents with the kind of performative concern that made the air taste like copper. "I apologize that Clipboard here thinks watching YouTube videos about sign language qualifies her to make surgical recommendations." The room went dead silent. You could hear the ventilator in the adjacent bed wheeze its mechanical rhythm through the thin walls. Laura's hands dropped to her sides. She took one measured breath. Her jaw didn't clench. Her face didn't flush. What happened instead was worse. What happened was control so absolute it made Hargrove's eyes narrow. A single tear traced her left cheek, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with him, her movement precise as a sniper drawing a sight line. "I've seen what integrity costs, doctor," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was steady as a surgical laser. "Have you?" Hargrove's jaw tightened. The muscle beneath his left ear spasmed once, twice. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected tears, retreat, the crumble that came from shame. He'd expected to watch her crack, and instead he was looking at something harder than bone, something that had already survived being broken and had fused back together wrong, in a way that made it stronger. He turned and left without another word, his footsteps sharp and fast down the corridor. Marcus stared at Laura's face during the entire exchange with the kind of haunted recognition that comes from nearly remembering something essential. His eyes tracked down to her name badge, Belle Bennett, RN, then to the faded ink on his forearm, to the name Bennett tattooed there in letters that had followed him for a decade through 3 continents and a traumatic brain injury that had stolen most of what came before. His brow furrowed. The connection was there, floating just out of reach like a word on the tip of your tongue that you couldn't quite pull into your mouth. Something about her voice. Something about the way she'd looked at Hargrove, not with fear, but with the kind of knowing that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The TBI made the neurons misfire sometimes, the pathways between memory and recognition broken in ways that rehabilitation couldn't quite repair. He watched her leave the room and pressed his palm against the tattoo on his forearm, trying to make the connection hold. 2 days later, the break room smelled like stale coffee and regret. Laura sat with her lunch, a container of rice and grilled chicken she'd prepared Sunday, measured portions that matched the discipline of someone used to rationing everything, at a table by the window. 3 nurses immediately gathered their phones and left, their chairs scraping loud against the tile floor, the sound like fingernails on concrete. CNA Maria whispered to a resident as they passed, her voice carrying, "That's the one who thinks she knows better than the doctors." The other nurses didn't speak to her anymore. They didn't ask about her weekend. They didn't hold the door. They didn't make eye contact at the medication dispensary. The isolation was precise and coordinated, the kind that only happened when someone gave a signal. Laura knew that signal had come from Hargrove. She'd seen this pattern before, in the field, in forward operating bases where leadership decided someone was a problem that needed to be made radioactive. By Friday, a formal write-up appeared on the unit board in a plastic sleeve, visible to every staff member who passed through. The announcement was printed in the hospital's official letterhead, and it bore her name like a brand. Disciplinary action, RNL, Bennett, insubordination and overstepping scope of practice. Patient care decisions are not nursing jurisdiction. Staff counseling completed Friday. Further violations will result in termination proceedings. Laura read it while colleagues walked past, deliberately averting their eyes. Her hands didn't tremble. She didn't pull the paper down. She read it twice, noting the signature at the bottom, Dr. Marcus Hargrove, Chief of Orthopedic Surgery, and then she walked to her locker and clocked out early, the mechanical action of gathering her things the only response she allowed herself. That same evening, Hargrove reviewed Marcus Reeves's chart from his office on the 4th floor, his door closed, the city lights of San Diego spreading out across his desk like options. He scrolled through Laura's documentation, detailed surgical assessments, pain management protocols, a comprehensive analysis of communication strategies for deaf patients that included research citations and evidence-based recommendations. Her notes were better than most resident work. That was the problem. They were competent enough that someone would notice. Someone would eventually ask questions. And questions led to audits, audits led to investigations, investigations led to the discovery of how he'd been directing complex spinal cases to Apex Medical Devices overpriced titanium hardware for the past 4 years. $47,000 in the last quarter alone. Not direct payments, those would be illegal. Consulting fees. Educational grants. Speaker honorariums. The kind of arrangements that existed in the space between law and crime, where powerful people lived with impunity. A competent nurse asking surgical questions was a thread that could unravel everything. He picked up his office phone and dialed Board Chairman Reynolds, catching him between holes at Torrey Pines. "Marcus," Hargrove said, his voice casual as someone discussing the weather. "I need to flag something. The Bennett nurse in orthopedics, have we thoroughly verified her background? Patient safety, you understand. Her credentials seem incomplete." There was a pause on the line. The sound of wind across a golf course. "I'll make some calls," Reynolds said. Hargrove hung up and opened his desk drawer, where 3 Apex Medical Devices business cards sat next to his personal checkbook. He set them aside and began typing an email to HR. "I'd like to expedite a credentialing review for RN Bennett. Please pull complete employment history and verification documentation for my assessment." The machine was already moving. It moved quietly. It moved with the kind of precision that came from practice. What they didn't know was that Laura Bennett's file didn't exist, at least not the version that made sense on a civilian form. There were no employment records before 5 years ago. No nursing school transcripts. No military discharge papers. Just a single document stamped classified in bold red letters, and a DoD directive that said in bureaucratic language designed to end curiosity, previous identity designation sealed under national security protocol. Do not request additional documentation. The next words out of Hargrove's mouth, delivered in a phone call to Catherine Morse, the State Nursing Board's external investigator, 3 days later, changed everything. "I'm concerned about her credentials," he said to Morse, his tone soaked in the kind of professional worry that sounded genuine because it was genuine. He was genuinely worried. "Perhaps you could conduct a site visit. I'd hate for Mercy General to have liability exposure." Morse arrived Tuesday morning with a briefcase that clicked open like a trap. She was 62, with grey hair cut short and the manner of someone who'd spent 30 years asking questions that made powerful people uncomfortable. She didn't know she was being weaponized. She didn't know that Hargrove had hand-selected her specifically because she was thorough, because she was relentless, because she actually did her job instead of accepting the easy answer. "I'll need complete employment history," Morse said to the credentialing office director, a woman named Patricia who'd worked at Mercy General for 19 years and understood how the world actually operated. "Educational verification, military service records if applicable." Everything. They pulled Laura's file, spotless performance reviews dating back 5 years, skills assessments that rated her in the 99th percentile for clinical competency, 0 complaints, 0 incidents. But before that, nothing. No previous hospitals. No educational background. No references that predated her arrival in Seattle. And then, buried in the file, the classified document. Morse's eyes narrowed as she read it. "This is highly irregular," she said. "Without verified credentials spanning her entire career, her license validity is technically in question." Where did she come from before Seattle Grace? "We don't ask," Patricia said quietly. "We were told not to ask. Federal directive. National security protocol." But that wasn't quite true anymore. Someone was asking now. Someone was pulling at threads. Meanwhile, in his room on the orthopedic wing, Marcus Reeves deteriorated with the slowness of water draining from a basin. The pain increased. His mobility decreased. The chart accumulated refusal notes. 15 consecutive physicians had declined to take his case. 15 different doctors citing 15 different reasons: communication barriers, liability concerns, insufficient surgical candidacy, complex presentation, better served by another facility. Each note typed with clinical precision, each one a small act of abandonment. Laura reviewed his case overnight, her apartment dark except for the desk lamp, her fingers moving across medical journals and surgical protocols for spinal reconstruction in deaf patients. The research existed. The procedures existed. What didn't exist was the willingness to try. She recognized the pattern because she'd seen it before, in field hospitals in Marjah where the DoD sent the complicated cases, the ones too broken for anyone to want to claim credit for saving. She wrote a detailed memo to Dr. Hargrove requesting surgical consult override, documentation of why 15 physicians refusing care violated patient safety protocols, a recommendation that Marcus be scheduled for immediate spinal imaging and assessment. She left it on his desk Thursday morning at 6:11 a.m., before the hospital fully woke. He read it at 7:45 a.m. and scheduled her termination meeting for that same afternoon. Wednesday morning at 6:02 a.m., Laura stood in the doorway of Marcus's room and knew something was wrong. His color was wrong. Pale as old bone. The monitors sang their shallow song, heart rate climbing, a rhythmic flutter that shouldn't exist. She didn't run to him. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd spent 11 hours holding a trauma bay together under fire. 1 step. 2. Her hand on his chest, feeling the rapid percussion of a heart drowning in its own sac. Marcus's eyes snapped open. Sweat pooled at his collarbone despite the cool hospital air. His neck veins distended like rope pulled taut. Laura signed without speaking, her hands moving in the clean language they'd been using since Monday. Pain? Breathing? He signed back frantically, both hands trembling, pointing to his chest. His eyes were the color of storm-darkened water, and they found hers with an intensity that made something in her chest tighten. She'd seen that look before, across a moonlit compound in Helmand Province, across a stretcher being loaded onto a Black Hawk, across the body of a man she'd sworn wouldn't die in Afghan dirt. But his brain injury had stolen the connection. He was drowning in the present moment, unable to reach the past that lived in her bones. Laura reached for her pager. 3 short taps. Code in radiology. Dr. Chen was a second-year resident, which meant he was young enough to still believe he had time to figure things out. He arrived in under 90 seconds, moving with the careful precision of someone walking through his own fear. His eyes went to the monitor first. Peaked, irregular. Atrial fibrillation morphing into something worse. His face did what young doctors' faces do when they recognize they're drowning. "We need cardiology," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. "I can't, we should wait for." The monitor screamed. Marcus's pressure dropped, 90/60. Then 80/50. The numbers fell like a man descending into dark water. Laura was already moving. She didn't wait for permission because permission was a luxury of people who had time. She pulled the ultrasound machine, the same machine she'd used in Marjah to scan for internal bleeding with mortar rounds landing 300 meters away. The probe was cold against her palm. Her hands were steady. Hands steady as a surgical laser. She placed it on his chest, tilted the angle, and there it was, a dark shadow pooling around his heart like motor oil. Fluid. Blood or serous fluid, it didn't matter. What mattered was that it was compressing his heart, squeezing it like a fist closing a round stone. Cardiac tamponade. You're going to feel pressure, she signed with her left hand while her right hand was already reaching for the spinal needle, the 18-gauge, the one that would slide between his ribs like a thin silver prayer. You're going to feel better after this. Trust me. Something flickered across his face. Not memory, his brain couldn't hold memory anymore, but something older. Muscle memory. Soldier's recognition. The kind of trust that lives in the body when the mind forgets how to believe. She marked the insertion point below his xiphoid process, the lowest point of his sternum where you could slip a needle into the pericardial space without hitting lung or liver or the fragile wall of his beating heart. She'd done this procedure exactly once before. In 2009. In the dark. While rounds were coming from the north. She'd done it with a field needle and a prayer, and her hands had known exactly where to go because that's what 11 years of Navy training does. It carves the knowledge deep enough that muscle memory survives anything. Dr. Chen, step back, she said. Not asked. Commanded. Her voice had dropped an octave. The timid nurse who'd been taking his humiliation all week had stepped somewhere deeper inside, and in her place stood a woman who'd held lives together in her bare hands. He moved. Laura advanced the needle with ultrasound guidance, watching the needle tip approach the fluid collection on the screen. 3 centimeters. 2. 1. The needle pierced the pericardial membrane and she felt it, that small give, like pushing through the skin of fruit. She pulled back on the syringe and the chamber filled with straw-colored fluid. 60 milliliters. 70. 80. Marcus's chest rose. His color shifted from bone white to something resembling human. The monitor's frantic scream softened into something almost regular. 100/65. 110/70. The numbers climbed like a man pulling himself back from a drowning. Better, she signed. He nodded, tears running down his face, his eyes locked on hers with the weight of something he couldn't name. His hand reached toward her. His fingers trembling. His lips moved without sound, the way deaf people do sometimes when emotion is too big for sign language, and she watched his mouth form a single word her brain recognized but her heart couldn't accept. Her name. No. Not possible. His traumatic brain injury had taken most of his memory. The doctors had said he'd never recover the lost files. The Pentagon had said the same thing about her, that once you're classified, once you're sealed, once you're dead on paper, you stay that way. People don't come back. Files don't unseal themselves. But something flickered across his face, the ghost of recognition his damaged brain couldn't quite hold. Laura documented everything in precise clinical language. Pericardiocentesis performed at bedside using ultrasound guidance. 85 milliliters of serosanguineous fluid removed from pericardial space. Cardiac output restored. Vitals stabilized. Patient responsive. No complications. The documentation was perfect because documentation was armor. Documentation protected you. Documentation created the paper trail that would keep the lie alive. Dr. Chen was staring at her with an expression carved from equal parts awe and terror. His hands were shaking. How did you or where did you learn? Nursing school, she said, meeting his eyes. Her voice was quiet again, carefully controlled, the mask sliding back into place. Intensive care elective. You should probably call cardiology now. Just to be safe. He nodded like a man agreeing with instructions he didn't understand. He was already reaching for his phone when Laura walked out of the room, past the nurse's station where Kelly was pretending not to watch, past the supply room where her jacket hung with the worn combat boots she'd carried from one life to another. The boot leather was scuffed at the heel from thousands of miles of running. From extraction. From walking Marcus 3 miles through Marjah while gunfire painted the sky. From a lifetime of carrying weight that the world had decided didn't exist. 30 minutes later, on the 4th floor in a hospital administrator's suite, Dr. Hargrove was watching security footage of the pericardiocentesis on a monitor the size of a television screen. His face had the particular stillness of a man watching his entire strategy collapse in real time. A nurse who didn't exist had just performed a procedure that only physicians were licensed to do. A nurse who'd handled it with the precision of someone who'd done it 100 times before. He lifted his phone. His fingers moved like they belonged to someone else entirely, someone older, colder, more afraid. "This is Dr. Hargrove. I need to speak with legal immediately. We have a serious problem." His voice was controlled fury barely leashed. "We have a nurse practicing medicine without a license. And I want her credentials suspended and I want her out of this hospital today. I don't care about paperwork. I don't care about procedure. She's a liability. She doesn't legally exist before 2018 and she just performed an invasive procedure that a resident physician couldn't handle. If this goes to the board, if this becomes public, if," he paused, listening to something the person on the other end was saying. His jaw tightened. "I don't care. Make it happen. By noon. And pull her entire personnel file. Everything. Every evaluation, every incident, every reference. I want ammunition." He hung up and sat in the silence of his office, watching the frozen image of Laura Bennett holding a needle perfectly still, saving a patient that 15 doctors had collectively decided wasn't worth saving. Her hands weren't shaking. Her face was a mask. Her eyes were locked on that man like she was keeping him alive through sheer force of will. He'd underestimated what she was. He was only now beginning to understand that she was the kind of thing that couldn't be broken by humiliation or isolation or lies. She was the kind of thing that had survived worse than anything a hospital administrator could engineer. And that terrified him. Within 60 minutes of Marcus Reeves flatlined in Trauma Bay 3, Dr. Hargrove made his first call. Not to the Quality Assurance Committee. Not to hospital administration about the misdiagnosis that nearly killed a patient. His call went to Board Chairman Reynolds, a man who'd received 2 comped orthopedic surgeries courtesy of Hargrove's referral network and owed favors the way most people owed money. Hargrove's voice was smooth, controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He didn't mention the pericardiocentesis. He didn't mention that a nurse with questionable credentials had just performed an invasive procedure that saved a life. He mentioned something far more useful: liability. A nurse acting outside her scope. Documentation gaps in her file. The possibility of regulatory exposure if the wrong people started asking questions. Reynolds listened. Reynolds understood. Within 90 minutes, Hargrove had contacted the credentialing department at San Diego Regional, Laura's previous hospital, asking vague, poisonous questions about her reliability. Did she follow protocol? Any concerns about judgment? Anything unusual about her departure? The poison had a way of spreading through professional networks like infection through a wound. By noon, Hargrove had initiated the second phase. He brought in Catherine Morse from the State Nursing Board's Credentialing Investigation Unit. Morse was thorough, methodical, the kind of investigator who found what she was directed to find. She arrived at Mercy General with a mandate to review Laura Bennett's entire credentialing file, her credentials application, her employment history, her references. What she found was silence. The kind of silence that only federal SEALs produce. Laura's employment record before 2018 didn't exist. Her nursing license application listed no military service. No background before 5 years ago. Just an employment gap that stretched backward into darkness, and a cryptic federal directive stamped classified that said her previous identity had been sealed under national security protocols following an operation in Marjah province, and that any attempt to access or disclose those records would trigger federal notification. Moore sat across from Hargrove in his office on Tuesday afternoon, the credentialing file open between them like an indictment. She didn't need to be told what to do. The file told her. Falsified credentials. Misrepresentation of employment history. A nurse who'd lied about who she was, or at minimum, a nurse whose truthfulness couldn't be verified because the truth had been erased by the federal government. By Tuesday at 2 o'clock, Laura was summoned to the HR conference room on the 4th floor. She knew. She'd seen the investigator. She'd watched Hargrove's face during the pericardiocentesis, watched it drain of color when her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone trained in field trauma surgery. She knew this was coming the way a person knows a storm is coming, not by the sky, but by the way the air pressure changes. The conference room smelled like recycled air and the kind of institutional cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Patricia Mills, the director of nursing, sat at the head of the table with the expression of someone performing an unpleasant duty. Hargrove sat beside her, his face arranged in an expression of regret that didn't touch his eyes. Catherine Morse opened the file. Laura sat with her hands folded, her posture perfect, her breathing steady. This was what composure looked like at the moment the world shifted. Morse's voice was professional, calibrated, the voice of someone reading a verdict. Your credentialing file contains significant gaps, Ms. Bennett. Prior employment history cannot be verified. Your nursing license application lists no military service, yet federal documents indicate classified records exist. Under state nursing regulations, falsified credentialing is grounds for immediate termination and license suspension. Hargrove leaned forward. His voice carried the weight of false concern. You performed an invasive procedure this morning beyond your scope of practice. You've repeatedly questioned physician judgment. And now we discover you may have lied about who you are. Laura didn't flinch. She didn't defend herself. She took one measured breath, and in that pause, something shifted in her bearing, not toward fear, but toward a kind of clarity that made the room feel smaller. One tear traced down her left cheek. She didn't wipe it. She held Hargrove's eyes and spoke in a voice that sounded like it came from a depth he couldn't measure. I've never lied about who I am, Doctor. I've only obeyed orders to forget. The words sat in the silence like shrapnel. Mills slid the termination letter across the table. Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. Your nursing license is suspended pending state board review. Laura picked up the letter without reading it. She stood, her movements fluid, economical, controlled. She walked toward the door. Hargrove stood as well, as if standing would somehow reclaim authority over a room she was leaving. You should have thought about your career before you thought about playing hero. Laura paused at the door. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet enough to require silence to hear it. You should have thought about your patient before you thought about your kickbacks, Doctor. The room detonated into shouting. Mills's face burned red. Hargrove opened his mouth, closed it. Moore stared at Laura with the dawning realization that she'd been used to terminate someone without being told exactly why. But that wasn't the worst part. Security escort came at 3 o'clock, 2 officers in grey uniforms, professional and impersonal, the kind of neutral that made humiliation official. They walked her through the corridors of Mercy General, past the nurses' station where colleagues suddenly found urgent business away from the hallway, past the trauma bays where 15 doctors had refused Marcus Reeves and 1 nurse with classified scars had saved his life instead. Her personal items fit into a cardboard box. It was a small life, 7 years of shift work could be contained in something you carried with 2 hands. Marcus Reeves sat in his wheelchair by the physical therapy gymnasium when she passed. He'd been watching for her. His eyes found her face, and something in his expression shifted, recognition without memory, the way a person recognizes a song they've forgotten they knew. His hands moved in sharp, urgent ASL, that's her. That's the one. I know her. Please. Someone stop her. Please. The security guards kept walking. Laura kept walking. No one in the hallway spoke ASL. No one interpreted. Marcus's mother asked what he was signing. The staff member wheeling him shrugged and redirected his chair. By 4 o'clock, Laura sat in her car in her driveway in Hillcrest with the cardboard box on the passenger seat. The evening light turned San Diego the color of copper and rust. She didn't turn the key. She didn't get out. She sat in the silence and let herself feel the precise weight of erasure, the way a person disappears not by vanishing, but by being removed from every place they'd ever belonged. That night, the nightmares came like incoming fire. Marjah Province. The field hospital with its open sides and the sound of helicopter rotors vibrating through the canvas. The smell of blood and antiseptic and diesel exhaust mixing in the Afghan heat. Hands, so many hands, her hands, pressing gauze to wounds, threading full lines through arms that belonged to men whose names she wasn't supposed to remember. And a voice, clear and steady even as rounds impacted the tent walls, Petty Officer Reeves, I've got you. I've got you. You're not dying in Afghan dirt. I promise you that. Marcus Reeves. She'd carried him 2.3 miles through enemy fire with his spine shattered and his eardrums blown out. She'd promised him he would live. She'd kept that promise. And 5 years later, federal orders had told her to forget. By Friday morning, she was sitting in the intake waiting room at the VA hospital in La Jolla, wearing a patient gown the color of institutional green, surrounded by veterans whose wounds were visible, a man with a prosthetic left leg reading a magazine with the focus of someone using reading as armor, a woman with burn scars covering her right side from collarbone to elbow, an older man whose hands trembled with Parkinson's while he filled out intake forms. She'd once treated wounds like theirs in desert field hospitals. She'd once known their names. Now they didn't recognize the ghost sitting among them. An intake nurse called her name. Laura Bennett. Not senior chief. Not petty officer. Just a name, just a woman, just another veteran trying to sleep without the sound of gunfire in her head. She stood and walked toward the intake nurse, and for the first time in 5 years, since the moment federal agents had shown her new social security cards and new driver's licenses and told her the people she'd served with were dead to her, officially dead, legally dead, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Not hidden. Not erased. Just broken. Just visible. Just finally asking for help. The intake nurse smiled with the practiced warmth of someone trained in trauma. What brings you in today? Laura sat down. She looked at the woman across from her and told the truth. I need to sleep without screaming. I need to remember without it destroying me. I need to know if I'm allowed to be who I was, now that no one thinks I was anyone at all. The conference room door exploded inward with the force of a 17-year-old carrying 17 years of silence. Daniel Bennett stood in the frame, his uniform still crisp from school, a shadow box clutched against his chest like a shield. The room froze. Hospital administrators stopped mid-breath. Lawyers closed their laptops. All eyes pivoted to this kid whose face carried the exact same architecture as the nurse they'd fired 48 hours prior. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, Daniel said, his voice steady in the way only children of soldiers learn to speak. And you people don't know what you've done. He set the shadow box on the conference table. The medals caught the fluorescent light, bronze catching fire, ribbon colors bleeding into the wood grain. A bronze star. Then another. Then a third. Then a ribbon of navy blue trimmed in white, the kind reserved for operations that reshape how wars are fought. The nurse from credentialing stood slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for a file folder marked classified, sealed BY Federal Directive. Her voice cracked reading the first citation aloud, Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, for extraordinary heroism under fire in Marjah, Helmand Province, Afghanistan, November 2013. The words hung in the recycled air like grenades. She held a trauma bay alone for 11 hours while under direct enemy fire. Organized extraction for critically wounded operators under sustained gunfire. Performed emergency surgical procedures with handmade instruments and battlefield improvisation. The nurse's eyes moved to Marcus Reeves, sitting in his wheelchair at the back of the room. Recognition flickered across her face. The patient she saved was The door opened again. A man in a dress uniform stepped through, Commander James Mitchell, Marcus's former SEAL Team 3 Charlie platoon leader, his chest a constellation of medals earned the hard way. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He simply began to speak with the precision of someone who'd briefed generals. Bronze Star. Mitchell's voice like a diesel engine at idle. Bronze Star. Pause. The room understood these weren't decorations. They were proof. Bronze Star. Mitchell's eyes fixed on the shadow box. And a Navy Cross. That last one for the operation in Marjah where Senior Chief Bennett held ground that shouldn't have been holdable. Where she carried my men out of hell. 4 of them. She carried 4 wounded operators to the extraction zone while the Taliban poured fire from 3 directions. Mitchell's jaw tightened. I've commanded SEALs for 23 years. I've seen operators break under pressure that would shatter normal people. Senior Chief Bennett didn't break. She got my men home. The silence was thick enough to operate in. An FBI agent entered then, Special Agent Sarah Torres, her badge catching the same light that had caught the medals, and she took the folder from the credentialing nurses shaking hands. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett's military records were sealed under national security protocol following the Marjah operation in 2013, Torres said, not as information but as indictment. Her previous identity, her service record, her clearance level, all classified. That's not unusual for senior operators. What is unusual is that Dr. Richard Hargrove attempted to access those sealed records without authorization. Attempted to discredit them. Attempted to have them destroyed. Torres pulled up her phone and turned it toward the room. Security footage played in color, a timestamp reading 2:14 a.m., a server room, Dr. Hargrove's face illuminated by monitor glow, his fingers moving across a keyboard like he was trying to erase his own existence. Like if he deleted the evidence of who Laura Bennett was, she would stop existing entirely. Our IT administrator, Robert Chen, Marine Corps veteran, 0311 Infantry, recognized the security breach at 2:16 a.m., Torres continued. He'd been backing up hospital files for 3 weeks. Billing records. Equipment purchase orders. Consulting fee transfers. She pulled up another screen. $230,000 in kickbacks from Apex Medical Devices over 18 months. Dr. Hargrove was refusing complex cases because successful outcomes with standard hardware would expose how unnecessary the expensive Apex equipment was. When Nurse Bennett advocated for patient care over profit margins, she threatened his entire scheme. A hospital attorney stood, face gone the color of old linen. The State Medical Board received the FBI report at 4:02 a.m. Friday. We received notification of Dr. Hargrove's license suspension at 6:03 a.m. It became revocation status by Monday afternoon. The words came out like water circling a drain. Criminal charges are pending. Healthcare fraud. Insurance fraud. Witness intimidation. Destruction of evidence. The room stayed silent. That was the worst part, the silence. Not the anger or the arguing. Just the sound of 15 doctors suddenly understanding what they'd refused to see. 6 months later, Laura walked past a strip mall in Claremont, her new VA hospital badge still feeling unfamiliar against her chest. Through a storefront window, she saw a folding table. A hand-printed banner reading discount insurance, all policies in letters that were already starting to curl at the edges. Dr. Hargrove stood behind that table in a wrinkled shirt, holding brochures that no one wanted, his medical career a ghost that would never come back to haunt him again. He'd been convicted. He'd served 60 days of a suspended sentence. He'd made restitution that was still draining his accounts. His license revocation meant he would never practice medicine again, never hold a scalpel, never make another clinical decision that mattered. When he saw Laura through the glass, his eyes dropped first. She didn't slow down. She didn't acknowledge him. She continued 3 blocks north to the Bennett Trauma Center, where the plaque beside the entrance read, "In honor of those who serve in silence," because that's what the VA had chosen to call the new wing. Because that's what Laura Bennett had done for 23 years, served in silence, held the line in the dark, saved people whose names she'd never be allowed to speak. Marcus Reeves waited in the physical therapy gym, walking now with less assistance after the spinal surgery that the VA surgeon, convinced by Laura's 17-page case notes, had performed successfully. His gait was still favoring his right side, still careful, still learning to trust his body the way he'd once trusted Navy training. He wore a translator device now, a wireless earpiece connected to his phone, and when he signed, his voice came through speakers calibrated to his preferred pitch, lower, controlled, like sand moving across stone. "I brought you something," Marcus signed, and even through the synthesized audio, Laura heard the meaning underneath. The weight of 10 years. The cargo he'd carry because something in his broken brain insisted these boots mattered. He opened a locker and pulled out combat boots. Desert dust still visible in the creases. Scuffs that told stories of terrain nobody talked about. Laura recognized them the moment she saw them because they were hers, the boots she'd given Marcus in Marjah when his had been destroyed by the same explosion that had scrambled his memory, the same explosion that had made him forget her voice but never her name, tattooed on his forearm like a promise his body made when his mind couldn't. "These are yours," Marcus signed. "They've been home." Laura took them, her hand steady for the first time in 6 years. Not shaking. Not trembling. Just holding. Just receiving. Just accepting that some promises survive everything, classification protocols and sealed records and institutions designed to make people disappear. Daniel came by the office after school, still in his uniform, and he stopped when he saw the shadow box finally mounted on Laura's wall. 3 bronze stars. 2 purple hearts. 1 Navy cross. Not hidden anymore. Not sealed away in a locker at the bottom of a closet that smelled like old uniforms and older silence. "Mom," Daniel said, and his voice carried something he'd been waiting to say for months. "I'm proud of you. I was always proud of you. But now the world gets to be proud too." Laura's phone buzzed that evening. A text from Commander Mitchell, 3 more of your Marjah patients just enrolled in the program. They heard you were back. She typed back, "I never left. I was just hiding." The truth was simpler than any classified file could capture. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story about the people who save us when no one's watching. Like this video if you believe true strength is quiet. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? What would you have done in Laura's position?